Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Caitlin and I'm PI Senior Campaigns Officer. Hi.
My name is Gus and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
My name's Ed. I'm a Senior Technologist at Privacy International.
Today's edition, we have a guest speaker named Matthew Hodgson who is going to help us navigate the tricky modern challenges of what you could consider the crypto wars 3.0, but also how do we navigate a world of big tech dominating the services we use with a particular focus on messaging apps.
Cool.
So hi everybody, thanks for having me on. I'm Matthew Hodgson. I'm the project lead for Matrix, the end-to-end encrypted secure protocol for decentralized communication. My day job is CEO and CTO at Element, which is the company that we created in a desperate effort to fund our attempts to create Matrix.
So I guess the first question, at least for me, because I'm the least technical person here, like, what is Matrix? If someone is coming to this and they've used WhatsApp and Signal and that's it, like, what actually is Matrix?
So, I mean, the way I think of Matrix is as being the missing communication layer of the web. So if you look back to the early days of the web, the dream from Tim Berners-Lee was that you would have this big fabric that connects everybody and people can publish information into it and they can receive information into it. And it will be this amazing democratic sort of infrastructure which could be used for both websites and communication. And the problem is that the web got far too successful far too early on for websites and web apps and web pages. And we never really quite got to the bit where people would be able to use it as a read-write web where people can communicate and publish and consume in a standard manner. Matrix is our attempt to fix that, I guess, 20, 30 years later, going and providing this universal communication layer so that people, no matter what system they're using, no matter what app they're using, would still have a way to connect, whether that's instant messaging or video. So it's a million miles away from WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and all the other systems, which are very, very centralized, run by a single logical entity who you have to trust implicitly, effectively, to go and look after your communication for you. In some instances, they lie through their teeth, like Telegram, and market themselves as encrypted when they are not really. Others, they are run by advertising companies like Meta, even though I think the WhatsApp guys try to do a good job of privacy and security, despite being owned by an ad company, there is still a slight conflict of interest there. Or it's something like Signal, which is run by a single US nonprofit and sits on Amazon, and you have to trust the Signal guys to be absolutely impeccable in their security practices and not be at the receiving end of every possible attack in the world because it's one of the more popular systems and there is only one instance of it. And so you put all of your eggs in one basket when you communicate via Signal. So the whole idea of Matrix is that everybody has the ability to either run or select their own instance and yet talk to everybody else. So on the public Matrix network today, we've got 151 million registered accounts. Obviously, not all of those are active, but they are spread over around 100,000 server instances. So think of it being a lot like email or the web, where you have lots of different servers dotted around the internet, run by different people, some of them massive, like, I don't know, the French government or the German government or Mozilla, Wikipedia, the United Nations, NATO, folks like that, all the way down to individuals who run Matrix servers on a little Raspberry Pi under their bed, like me. Or probably Ed. Ed, do you run one?
I do, actually, although it's no longer on a Raspberry Pi. It's on a VM somewhere, but yes, I do run one.
It's basically something that you run on your own terms, or you go and farm it out to somebody you trust. And so you have complete sovereignty. You're not dependent on an American tech company, be it a for-profit or a non-profit one. And you can choose to interoperate with the rest of the network, or you can keep it to yourself. So it really democratizes communication and allows people to have secure Signal-style communication, but entirely on their own terms. And I think we're fairly unique in doing so.
there's two things arising from what you've said. First, I just want to dig beneath the surface just a little bit on your Telegram comment, because our lawyers are rightly going to say, well, hold on, you can't speak about a company that might get angry at us without being explicitly clear. And so Telegram does have encryption. It's just not necessarily end-to-end encryption. Is that the understanding amongst all of us here as to how Telegram is different at the security level to the rest?
It's a bit more subtle than that. I mean, sure, it has transport layer encryption, the equivalent to HTTPS. It does also have end-to-end encryption, but only if you explicitly turn it on for secret chats. So for all of the typical group conversations or normal one-to-ones that most people use on Telegram, the data is stored unencrypted on the server. So they market themselves as a secure messenger, but it has a totally different privacy profile to, say, Signal or Element or a Matrix client or something like Threema or Wire or one of the other end-to-end encrypted systems, which is end-to-end encrypted by default for all private communication.
So as executive director, I also have to say this. We don't endorse products, even the ones we use. And the reason I'm so fascinated and so grateful that you've joined us today is because we love talking about the challenges of using technologies, including the ones that we use. And we also love to hear about the challenges in creating them. And you've been at this for a while. And we've been at this for a while. And there's been leaps and bounds of progress made in privacy and security since we all started in this strange little game that we're in. But I'd be curious to hear from you, Matthew, what's that journey been like and how hard has it been and what's hurting now as a result?
Well, you're right that we've been at it a while. Depressingly, it's been 10 years since we began Matrix back in May 2014. And it's been, as always, not a particularly linear path. So, I mean, the history here is the team has actually been together for almost 22 years, depressingly. It's old enough to drink in the US, basically since university, at the expense of giving away my age. And at first, we were doing VoIP technology, very ironically, for the Big Brother TV show.
Oh, God.
Our big customers was Endemol, the Dutch production guys who created Big Brother. And if you had the misfortune, the amazing experience of engaging with the Big Brother TV show around 2006 or 7 in the UK, you might have done so using a mobile phone, pre-smartphone. And so what we did was to build the technology where you could take your old 3G flip phone, your clamshell, and dial in to the video stream of the Big Brother show interactively and leave your own comments in the Big Brother diary room and select which camera in the house to watch by pressing the DTMF buttons on the phone to select the camera and all this jazz. So that's our background, basically doing hardcore voice and video 10 years before the rest of the world does video calling. And we got acquired by an Israeli company called Amdocs, who do telecoms capability, so billing systems typically, in 2010. Rather amusingly, they bought the company for SMS interoperability. And so they kind of completely accidentally acquired this small set of VoIP experts. And what we did, and I promise this will answer your question, what we did was to start building basically messaging and VoIP apps, which would compete with Skype and WhatsApp, which at the time in 2011, 2012, were really starting to take over the world. And the pitch is that we would go to a mobile network operator like Singtel in Singapore or Tim Brazil in Brazil and say to them, hey guys, do you want to compete with WhatsApp? If so, we can make you, the telco operator, relevant once more and give you something that is even better than WhatsApp. So we went and built this app, which was proprietary, closed source, unencrypted, or at least not end-to-end encrypted, and had the same feature set that you would get today out of, say, WhatsApp or even Skype. So it had things like multi-party video calling, it had voice messaging, it had presence, it had streaming file transfers, so you could go and literally use it as a poor man's video broadcasting platform. All of this lovely stuff. It took us about 9 months, and we did most of it in the end for Telecom Italia in Brazil. And they went and hired an agency called RGA, pretty famous digital agency, to design this app. And it was called Blá, which apparently is a very cool word in Brazilian Portuguese. I never quite worked out whether they were having us on or not. But we built a really nice WhatsApp killer. And it did pretty well. It got to like 12% market penetration, which for a telco branded app is crazy. Like they had 79 million subscribers, and we had like 15 million deployments running in this data center that we built in Sao Paulo, running loads and loads of machines, doing this proprietary centralized communication product. And the problem is the WhatsApp had 98.6% market penetration. And that was in 2013, so over 10 years ago, which is crazy. And we realized that we needed to get out of here and do something different, because how do you compete with WhatsApp when it's taking over the world like that?
But what's ironic is that rather than try to compete by creating a centralized service, you kind of stuck to that, the idea that a service would be localized to whether it's a telco or in the case of Brazil. It's interesting you didn't try to take over the world with a WhatsApp killer that is just like WhatsApp.
Yeah, well, we couldn't. They already had first mover advantage and had a perfectly reasonable product, and empirically had already taken over the world even 10 years ago. So the idea of trying to fight a centralized thing with an existing centralized thing felt pretty naive. You could see so many people saying, oh, wow, WhatsApp is really cool. I too will go and build a clone of WhatsApp. And how many of those have succeeded?
Can I ask, working with telcos and also being interested in encryption isn't necessarily always the easiest or natural kind of marriage. How did you find that kind of relationship? Because we talk a lot about telcos, but it's rarely politely.
Yeah, no, and quite right. I mean, honestly, at this point, 2012 or whatever, frankly, we were not optimizing for privacy or even freedom at all. We were just trying to keep the lights on and sell proprietary solutions to telcos. And as you are implying, telcos have to be regulated in order to get their telco license, to get access to radio spectrum. And dating back decades, if not centuries, they are subject to lawful intercept requirements so that the cops can go and wiretap people as required for investigations. And that's particularly true of places like Brazil, where the regulator is Anatel, who is pretty enthusiastic, as you will have seen when they go and arrest the Facebook local executives because WhatsApp refuses to backdoor their stuff and provide the lawful intercept capability that, in theory, they need. Whenever you're working with a telco, inevitably, there is a legal obligation to support wiretap stuff. So it wasn't great, but it's also basically the rules of the game if you are operating in that industry, which I hasten to add, we are not anymore.
Although I hasten to add that we keep on hearing stories from various countries where the police are trying to treat messaging apps as though they are telcos and keep on threatening to walk into the offices of messaging firms or large firms that run messaging services with kit. And it's like, okay, you can bring kit, but it doesn't work. But still, they keep threatening that exact same regime against messaging.
Well, I mean, the European Commission are currently looking at doing something very similar. Their 42-point going dark plan basically says anything that's end-to-end encrypted has to be backdoorable. This is the EU's Clipper chip. They're trying to push it into IoT, cars, everything. It's going to be everywhere. And of course, the UK have tried it as well.
Is literally what I was going to say. The Safety Bill and the Online Safety Act has the potential to head in the same direction of providing the telco regulator, Ofcom, the ability to go and demand wiretap equivalent capability in encrypted comms. So I guess we're getting away from the original question, which I will try to wrap up. But basically, we had built a really usable, pretty stable, featureful messaging platform as a non-open, non-encrypted, proprietary, centralized thing. So it was kind of mid-2013 that we were getting pretty fed up and didn't really want to be working in the telco space for many, many reasons. And so we actually went to the powers that be at Amdocs and said, guys, crazy idea. Either we're just going to leave and do something more fun, or what if we destroy the phone network? What if we go and disrupt the hell out of this and build a new communication layer on the internet rather than the telcos? And it will basically replace both the phone network and email as a interoperable way for people to communicate. And if we can pull that off, that is how we compete with WhatsApp. And we said, right, we're going to rebuild this thing. We're going to do it as open source. It's going to be non-profit. It's going to have its own brand. It's not going to have anything to do with Amdocs. And we'll call it Matrix and see where it goes. And we basically hunkered down for 3 years to go and build that. Now, to actually answer the original question, we naively thought that having already done this and produced a really pretty usable, mainstream, capable app with 10 million users, that's the easy bit, right? We know how to do that. And so we focused entirely on the actual decentralization piece at first, solving this problem of decentralized access control, where I need to be able to ban you from a chat room that is replicated on your server, even if I have no privilege on your server at all. Otherwise, it just becomes a complete anarchy. Turns out that problem had never been solved before. A whole bunch of PhDs in the University of Karlsruhe are to this day writing papers and printing more PhDs, analyzing what we call state resolution, the decentralized access control mechanism that Matrix has. Meanwhile, on the open source side, suddenly a huge community pops up overnight saying, oh my God, this is the big one. This is the opportunity to create the equivalent of Linux, but for communication. Just like, Linux turned up and destroyed the commercial Unix operating systems in the mid-90s, and Solaris and IRIX and HPUX died overnight. This is the one where Slack and Teams get destroyed, and the open source community takes over the entire communication space, and it's a new world order. And it was, as it was prophesied, and frankly, a very over-enthusiastic and slightly premature community, given how mature we are at the time. And we increasingly got very far from our original mission of building a mainstream successful app.
So part of the journey through Matrix obviously has been bolting on the end-to-end encryption, because Matrix as a protocol is still very metadata heavy. Mm-hmm. That's obviously as a privacy activist, I guess you could call me, that's obviously something that has played on my mind. And I have seen that there has been progression. And are reactions end-to-end yet, or are they still plain? I can't remember.
Reactions are still plain, unfortunately.
But obviously, one of the advantages is that if you're not federating, it's within your own server. How are you trying to bridge that problem of the metadata that is around the thing? Or can you, given that it is so decentralized, you necessarily have to have metadata around things?
Right. Okay. So this is the big one. So I guess, first of all, you said that end-to-end encryption is bolted on, which on one level is true in that we started without it and then we added it. Therefore, it is additive. However, we knew right from the outset that it would be required.
Right.
Now, interestingly, the reason for doing this is not that we are privacy activists primarily, and I would say that we characterize ourselves more as freedom activists. This is about democratizing communication. It's about empowering people to have autonomy and agency. And then privacy is kind of a necessary requirement for that, because if you decentralize conversations over all the participating servers, which is how Matrix works, obviously you need to encrypt those conversations so that random server admins can't start reading your messages. It's not a sort of anti-state or a sort of privacy as an ideology like, say, Signal does. It's more just pure pragmatism. Obviously, you don't want random sysadmins reading your messages if everybody can run a server and perhaps participate in the room. So that's where we came from on it. Now, as a result, perhaps, minimizing metadata wasn't a design goal, and it was very deliberately not a design goal. And in fact, the day that we announced end-to-end encryption in Matrix in, I think, August 2015, So only a year and a half into Matrix, we're at a conference called Jardin Anthropique in Rennes, which is an amazing CryptoPunk conference that runs literally every blue moon. I think that might have been the third one and the most recent one 10 years ago. It was quite a surreal event. It was only like 80 people there. And then Richard Stallman turns up and stands on a table and features free software for an hour and a half. And you had all the GNU-net people there. You had us banging on about encryption for the first time. And what my talk was 50-50, saying, guys, we've gone and added in encryption, but meanwhile, what are we going to do about metadata? So right from square one, we were painfully aware that on the server, as it stands today, the metadata exposes who is talking to who and when and in what rooms. You're right, the reactions are plain text, so you can see emoji reactions, what the emoji is currently. I guess technically also can see the presence data. If they have presence turned on, you can see typing notifications in plain text, who's typing. You can see read receipts. Basically everything other than the actual contents of the messages themselves are exposed to the server. And this was a deliberate trade-off because, frankly, it's been a nightmare to get encryption to work just for the data in a decentralized world, then also have the complexity of solving the metadata problem, which at that point, nobody had any idea how to do 10 years ago. At the time, there was actually one precedent out there, which was a technology called Pond, if you recall Pond.
Oh, yeah.
No, I don't.
No, this was like one of the very, very first metadata protecting communication systems done by a guy called Adam Langley, who is one of the main cryptography guys, AGL at Google. So, yeah, Adam is big TLS expert, responsible for many, many years for all of Google's encryption. He's a very smart cookie, and I think his website is imperialviolet.org off the top of my head. And he published this email system called Pond that basically obfuscated email, a bit like a mixnet, but basically delaying emails. And I think from memory, possibly using Tor hidden services. It's been a while and the project is long, long dead. But it was a very early onion-rooted style obfuscated emailing system to show that it could be possible to completely obfuscate the metadata of who is talking to who.
And just for our listeners to understand, onion routing is a type of transmission protocol, I guess, to put it, where you can essentially conceal both from the person you're sending to, but also the steps within the network where your communications are going and where they've come from. And it was developed by the U.S. Navy Naval Research Labs back in the 1990s, and it's been implemented in a variety of systems, but including Tor, which is what we're mentioning here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm actually looking at the Pond website right now, which tragically has not been touched in 9 years.
That is tragic because the reason Ed and I talk about metadata one of the reasons we talk about metadata so much when it comes to messaging apps is a few years ago, we got approached by the ICRC, the International Commission of the Red Cross, and they were just terrified when they heard the former director of the National Security Agency say that the U.S. government kills people based on metadata, and being concerned about the fact that ICRC operates in war zones and protects people who are fleeing war zones. They were interested in finding a messaging app that would protect metadata. And so they approached us and asked us to do some work with them. We wrote a report with them where we got in touch with all the messaging app companies at the time and asked them, what do you do about metadata? And the response was a resounding silence. Not a single company responded to us about what they do with metadata. It was shocking because all the companies wanted to talk to us about when it came to encryption. Mm-hmm. They wanted to say, hey, we do all the right things when it comes to end-to-end. But like even the ones that we would consider the kind of people that we would have a drink with occasionally, they just did not respond to our messages on metadata.
Oh, I mean, that required a lot of desk research because we had to go through all of their specifications and everything that they published, all hidden in white papers about, and Meta's a good one. They do publish a lot of the things of like, this is the access we give to law enforcement agencies, and the Facebook Messenger. I was reading about the way that they're tracking metadata to try and protect underage users from predatory people on their platforms, which obviously requires some form of metadata. So the stuff is out there, but obviously they don't want to talk about it because it is a problem. And the other side of it is that if Meta can see that this person's communicating with this person, so can anybody else.
Yep.
And yeah, they don't want to talk about that bit because it's very difficult. As you say, it's an unsolved problem at the minute.
And just even at the most banal level, to bring it to Matrix, a PI that uses Matrix, we run our own instance, and all the PI staff have accounts and usernames and whatnot. We started, and it was actually one of our techies, he started to change his username every time he went on leave or he was traveling. So that's, in a sense, metadata. You know, it's not the communication itself, but it's the identifying information around it. And then it occurred to us that all the other instances where there are people who are trying to follow PI through our general room or general sharing would also see the constant changes of usernames at PI. So they'll know when Ed's on leave. They'll know when Caitlin's traveling to Uganda. And that's metadata. That's that type of leakage. And, it's a virtue of the system, but it's also it's a sin.
Well, let me explain what we're doing about it. Because first of all, we agree that it's a problem. I mean, the simplest thing you can do, obviously, is to run your own server and not federate. And honestly, I think that gets underestimated as a solution to the problem.
Yeah.
Because so many people have federation turned on. That's why you might use Matrix.
Yes.
But the fact that if you do have accounts where you really, really want to keep a good operational security footprint, you can do what you can't do with Signal or Telegram or whatever, or WhatsApp, and just run it yourself in a server that nobody else knows about.
And vastly reduce your attack surface. It's brilliant in that regard.
Assuming, of course, that you know how to run that server securely, which is not always a given. And that's the big trade-off that Facebook is pretty good at running services at scale in a secure manner when they don't lock themselves out of their core network server cabinets. Whereas it's a hard ask for a kind of amateur sysadmin to run their own server securely. It can be done. And companies like Element try to make it easier by providing commercial distributions which are supported that go and let people run it safely rather than foot gunning themselves potentially. But that's that trade-off. But beyond that, the talk that I gave back at Jardin Entrepique was basically proposing a variant of Pond for going and protecting privacy. The idea being that Pond operated basically by just having store and forward servers as hidden services that you use as a dead drop to drop your messages on. Very similar to how Signal behaves as a centralized service today. And we started working on this about 4 years ago now under the guise of peer-to-peer Matrix. And you can go to arewep2p yet.com and see whether we are yet peer-to-peer yet on Matrix. The answer is a resounding no. Unfortunately, mainly due to funding, or entirely due to funding limitations. This is, as we said earlier, basically an unsolved problem. And whilst we have really good people, we got it to the point where basically you run the server in the client. Because if you don't have no servers, you don't have no metadata. And the client is identical. So you've got normal Element going and thinking that it's talking to a server in AWS or wherever. Yeah. It's actually just talking to it on localhost running within the app itself. It then uses an overlay network like the Pond model, which then allows you to talk through to other people. Either they have to be online at the same time, or you need a relay server, and at which point the relay servers are very, very similar to these kind of dead drop, blind store and forward systems who don't get to see any metadata other than some vague network timing and I guess the size of the data, which they might be able to infer some patterns, but you can then go the full enchilada and route it for a mixnet, at which point you have both a metadata preserving, privacy preserving, and an end-to-end encrypted system using all the feature set that you get from Matrix today. We actually demoed this at FOSDEM 2023, so now 18 months ago, complete with relay servers on Android and iOS, and it kicked ass. Amazing. Really? If I say so myself. You can install it right now and play with it on your phone. And the problem is that we ran out of money to work on it in June of last year.
This is real bleeding edge stuff, though. This is great.
Oh, it really is. We've got further than anybody else in actually getting the holy grail of metadata preserving peer-to-peer comms. It was actually being funded by one of the Western governments, because I haven't mentioned it, but the comedy plot twist with Element is that it turns out that even though we built this as a pretty anti-establishment democratizing communication mechanism, in practice, all the money comes from governments because it turns out they like to communicate securely themselves. Much as you mentioned, Tor was funded by the Navy Research Lab because the DoD is interested in secure communication when they're running around the world. Likewise, all of Element's funding these days comes from France, Germany, the US, UK, Sweden, name a country, and somebody in the government would have thought, oh, wouldn't it be good if we could communicate if Teams was down or if the US wasn't available for whatever reason? And they all come to us at Element. Either way, the peer-to-peer stuff was funded by one of these guys, and then it stopped due to entirely bureaucratic reasons. And as a result, we've just had to put it on ice for the last year. Very frustrating.
So we talked a little bit earlier about regulatory stuff. Do you find it frustrating when you're being funded by governments who are also trying to undermine your system? Like when the UK government gives you money and then does the Online Safety Act, is that annoying?
It would be a lot more annoying if we didn't have government customers and the government was turning up and saying, oh, you're not allowed to do encryption anymore. Because right now we can say, look, if you backdoor our encryption, the Ukrainian MOD, who use Element as one of their main communication systems, are going to be in a really bad place because they're already under attack in both cyber and obviously physically in many, many different ways. And if you force us to somehow weaken our encryption, that's really bad news.
Hold on. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense uses Matrix. Like, I totally agree with your point, which is when the government kept on going on about how they have to go after WhatsApp, I found it amusing when on the other side of the newspaper where there are articles talking about these horrible things happening and the government needs to get access to WhatsApp, you have articles about how the executive part of the government of the United Kingdom is using WhatsApp. They're ruling by WhatsApp and doing gossip by WhatsApp. And it's like, hold on, do they understand what they're doing? And the answer is absolutely not. They have no idea what they're doing with these policies. It kind of blows my mind. But if I could just switch gears a little bit to something that's a little less black and white for the fact that, you know, most of us on this call are privacy advocates. And I love the approach you've taken, Matthew, by saying this came out of pragmatism and also just the ethos of like the distributed nature of everything. Where we go to war with ourselves at PI is around interoperability. Because here you have a case of governments now saying, in order to combat the behemoths that are the large messaging platforms and big tech more generally, we need to allow for interoperability. And Ed will remember, because he was a party to this, we had a meeting at PI when the ideas were first floated. And like, I was fervently against interoperability because like I'd spent at least half my career begging the big tech firms to deploy end-to-end encryption. They finally do. And it's like, okay, there might be this might be the high watermark point. And then comes along interoperability, which we were in favor of in so many ways, and data portability. And, you know, for years, we've been working on competition policy because we wanted to take down big tech. But for it to be used on messaging, as it felt like it was a backdoor to disentangle end-to-end encryption. But I think like when Ed and I were having this discussion, it was much more sophisticated because we weren't just saying, oh, governments are being assholes. It's more like, okay, people in our community want interoperability. They don't want to have to download WhatsApp in order to speak to their family members when they're already using Signal and whatnot. But the fight that we were having was around things like metadata or around things like identity, and why force the meshing of these things when they are so different. But I imagine Matrix has a slightly different take on interoperability, as would most people who I work with. So it's okay for us to have this disagreement.
Well, I mean, we have a pretty strong position on it, which, as you say, really comes out of our pragmatic rather than dogmatic viewpoint, which is that we believe that you can maintain end-to-end encryption whilst having interoperability, which I think a lot of folks who first heard about the Digital Markets Act and equivalent regulation panicked and assumed it was a backdoor into encryption. And I got incredible amounts of hate from Alec Muffet saying that I was single-handedly destroying the fabric of civilization by pushing for the DMA. Because myself and my co-founder, Amandine, did go to Brussels and say, hello, European Commission, we think you can do interoperability without damaging end-to-end encryption. And here is a demo where we have Google Chat talking to Matrix, talking to WhatsApp, using client-side bridges to show that you can actually interoperate. Now, obviously, that comes at a metadata cost in that the users who are still on Google or Facebook or whatever, they already can see the metadata, and they would be able to see then the metadata of who they're talking to. But perhaps that is an acceptable trade-off as an initial stepping stone to breaking open the walled gardens and frankly disrupting the incumbents to allow a more progressive protocol like Matrix or whatever it might be to get some traction. So it's basically another play at that original idea of what weird Jedi mind tricks and judo flips can we do to try to displace the advertising company monopoly that WhatsApp has today. And cracking open the walls and providing open APIs and showing that you can interoperate and with end-to-end encryption to Matrix is a step in the right direction. And we then went further and re-implemented it. We need to figure out how to announce this, and I'm arguing with Meta PR literally today on what the blog post should look like for this. But over the last 6 months, we were one of the main guinea pigs who worked with Meta to go and figure out what their DMA APIs would look like. And critically, to show that you can maintain end-to-end encryption because they use signal ratchet, double ratchet, we use the signal double ratchet, and we plugged them together and we got messages flowing back and forth, and it works. And I think we're the first people in the world to ironically go full circle 10 years later and crack open the walled garden of WhatsApp. Obviously, the metadata then leaks between the two, but isn't that an interesting starting point where suddenly people who would otherwise be completely blinkered inside the WhatsApp tunnel now realize there are actually other apps, and you break down the network effects that stop people using those other apps by saying, hey, if you install Element, perhaps you will be able to talk to people on WhatsApp. I mean, it's probably better if they come over to native Matrix, and then you will actually have good metadata, assuming you're on your own server or assuming that we improve our metadata architecture, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's overall a good thing, but I do see why people were worried. Hopefully, we've assuaged many of those concerns. It really depends on whether you think that breaking down the network effects is worth the metadata trade-off. But frankly, the metadata is already bust for those users, and it's a bit of a Trojan horse to try to get people out of Facebook and into the rest of the world. So let's see where it goes. The flip side is that once we got the messaging interop into the bill and into the Act, for that matter, in the end, the only outfit who's been regulated by it is WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. Whereas we assumed that obviously iMessage would, because it's such a big walled garden, and obviously the Google ecosystem would too, and possibly Microsoft as well. And they all managed to wriggle out of it. So it's a little bit of a strange place right now. There is also the big, big problem that the EU can only legislate on EU citizens. And that means that the structure of the current DMA stuff is basically only available on both the WhatsApp side and also the Matrix side if you're physically in the EU, which makes it a lot less desirable as a general global empower people to interoperate if it's been geo-IP locked to people physically in the EU.
It makes me wonder, why did Apple allow for RCS? What was the pressure there?
It was in some ways quite a smart move on their side that they deliberately allowed the awful implementation in without potentially end-to-end encryption and said, oh, you don't need to regulate us. Look, we talk RCS.
For listeners, RCS is that other standard, which is arguably not a standard because Google practically owns it. And Google put a lot of pressure on Apple to allow for iMessage to use RCS because Google was recognizing that at least in the US, my understanding, this is entirely a US market fight, that Americans like using iMessage, and the colors of the messages on iMessage being blue really annoyed Android users and annoyed Google as a result. And so Google put a lot of political pressure on Apple to allow for RCS, which they did last year, if I recall correctly, or they're still in the process.
Yeah, I think they're still in the process. I think it's meant to launch in September alongside iOS 18. But honestly, the color of the bubbles is still going to be green. I mean, Apple are treating it like MMS or SMS, which it kind of is. It's basically the crappy telco interoperability thing. And meanwhile, Apple, coincidentally at the same time, went and put some truly bonkers post-quantum encryption into iMessage and have rolled out a whole bunch of other things like the ability to make your letters and words dance individually in your iMessages and all sorts of other differentiating things, so that they can have their cake and eat it. They can say, look, we interoperate via RCS. They need to regulate us on the DMA. We're the good guys.
But isn't that the natural outcome of interoperability, though? You end up with a client, I remember Trillion, because I used to have AOL and Yahoo and MSN Instant Messenger and all of it. I've got like 6
you have
things.
aged yourself right there. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, very much so.
Trillion too, if it's any consolation.
So I remember Trillion. The problem with Trillion was, yeah, you could talk to everybody on these things, but it had a tiny little subset of all of the features. It didn't have feature parity with any of them. Mm-hmm. Another side that I come at this with, I was one of the maintainers of one of the Matrix clients that came out. It's unfortunately no longer being used. It was Siphon that I worked on. Mm-hmm. We wanted to make that peer-to-peer. That was the plan. Unfortunately, it's kind of gone by the wayside now, as these things do. But again, the problem that we found was, if you're trying to get feature parity between clients, it's even difficult within the Matrix ecosystem. And then on top of that, we're adding in the interoperability of this ratchet needs to talk with this ratchet. Can you see that there will ever be a parity in any of these clients with true interoperability, or will they always be kind of the poor cousin of these clients, and you're always going to be better off going with the kind of native client, if you like?
Well, there will never be parity, and that's the feature. It's just like the web. Like, there will be some fancy web features which your browser doesn't implement yet, or some site decides to use, and then people catch up. And it's how innovation works in an open ecosystem like this. I would say it's a feature that different Matrix clients end up prioritizing different things. And if you bridge and turn through to DMA gatekeepers like WhatsApp or iMessage, sure, iMessage might do some fancy new feature like bouncing words, which won't be parity with the rest of the system. And if the users think that's a good feature to have, then that sort of pressure will evolve for somebody to write a Matrix spec change that says, by the way, if you want to bounce your words in Matrix, this is how you express it. Then it's very easy to add it to the hypothetical iMessage bridge, and then everybody else catches up too. And I wouldn't trade that off for being stuck in a silo like Signal any day. No, it's the whole vibrancy and opportunity and innovation of the web that it's this messy mix of things which basically line up, but sometimes they're a bit ahead and sometimes they're a bit behind, but they cannot be killed. Like, how do you stop the web?
I'm really excited about where this conversation is getting to, because I feel like there's been a lot of really interesting writing lately about rewilding, about how the internet and the web particularly has become this stale, annoying place. And I recently came across the idea on a podcast that described the web basically as Google's searches platform. And it's become so boring as a result. And there's this move now, because of a reaction to AI, that the web can be much more interesting again. The internet can become interesting again as we move away from the giants and whatnot. And I feel like that's what I find fascinating about this conversation, because we are talking about all of those challenges and how this is maybe that really interesting point where people can move away finally from these massive firms. But you're also describing is the pain over the last 10 years, the pain of an open source project, the coming and going of people, the coming and going of funding. And yet, if this potential rewilding occurs and projects and initiatives like yours start finding deeper and deeper roots. While it would be fascinating, do you think you can survive the world that we are also becoming, which is the world of the XZ hack, the world of war, and the world of governments with conflicting demands? Like, we know that WhatsApp and Meta and Apple can survive these kinds of worlds because they have many lawyers, they have trillions of dollars. Can you survive this kind of world if it does become a success for you?
Yes. Honestly, I think so. First of all, you can't kill it even if you wanted to. Just as I was saying about the web, it's a decentralized system. I'm not sure how you would attack it, short of a EMP or a nuclear war that takes out all of the kit. As long as there is a Git repository somewhere with the code in it, somebody can stand it up and keep running it wherever they are, whatever planet they're on. So the resilience that comes out of decentralization cannot be underestimated. In terms of funding, it's been a real roller coaster. Last year was awful. We had to downsize Element by 60% in order to stay afloat. And it was by far the worst year of my life so far, not to mention the folks who actually got impacted directly by it. But right now, Element, at least we're on a reasonable path to break even and sustainability. We're not there yet, but I'm really hoping that by the end of the year we may be there, at which point we have liftoff. Meanwhile, on the foundation side, we've split out the Matrix Foundation completely from the core team who've ended up working at Element. It's run by Josh Simmons, who used to be president of the Open Source Initiative. And they have just had elections to elect a governing board of 24 people to steer the overall protocol, not the technical protocol evolution, but basically the governance of the nonprofit, and also fundraise, and that's looking cautiously optimistic too. No, it's a decent chunky foundation, aiming for $1 million a year of donations, so not quite the 20 million that Signal gets or whatever, but sort of similar magnitude to some of the open source foundations. And I'm hoping that will only accelerate as we get more critical mass. And also the governance has got succession planning kind of built in. I'm not a benign dictator or benevolent dictator if I ever was, but I'm certainly not now. Instead, it's really become democratized such that if I get hit by a bus, there are a lot of other people who would not just have a massive power struggle, but hopefully just continue what they were doing, pushing Matrix in the right direction. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic right now.
Wonderful.
I'm glad we're not having this conversation last year.
Yes.
Can I ask, potentially stealing Gus's last question, but you said you felt a lot more optimistic this year. Obviously, it's to do with the stability and the governance processes and the organization. Are you equally increasingly optimistic about the regulatory environment, or is that kind of a different vibe?
No, it's definitely a different vibe. I mean, we're in the darkest timeline on the regulatory side, as we said earlier, with both the online safety bill, but frankly, chat control, if it goes through in the worst scenario that we're seeing right now, is absolutely terrifying, as Ad said earlier. And no, it's proper crypto wars free. The one thing that I guess gives me some reassurance is, again, the fact you can't kill something like Matrix. Even if the legislation goes berserk, you might just end up with a very large underground set of Matrix servers, or not so underground, or people running them in international waters, or whatever people have to do.
And that's the irony, because the first crypto wars were won on the basis that PGP existed and couldn't be regulated because it was already out there. And so government regulation was always going to be silly. The availability of open source and reliable services that can't be controlled is going to be what the Apples of the world and the Metas of the world say is the reason why you can't have crypto wars version 3.0, which is, that's great.
But then how do things like the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, which has a requirement that vulnerabilities be disclosed to ENISA, which is an EU government body, if I'm running my own Matrix server, is that my responsibility? And how does that kind of individual decentralized aspect jive with an increasingly scary regulatory environment?
Okay, I have to say that I know a lot more about DMA than CRA, but my understanding is that the people running the servers aren't subject to CRA. It's the people writing the servers, and even then, It's only the commercial people writing the servers. So Element, for instance, is well and truly subject to CRA, and we need to provide secure bill of materials and disclosures, as we do anyway. And frankly, I feel kind of smug and relieved that we have good security processes already that all of our government customers have always been asking for. They want to be sure that we don't have supply chain attacks and all the rest of it. The people who complain the most, it feels, about CRA, the people who were cutting corners and don't have any of that. It's what? You want me to prove that my software hasn't been backdoored? You're already in the right place. But as far as I understand, open source foundations like the Matrix Foundation wouldn't be subject to it. And if you're just running your own server, then it's not your problem. It's whoever wrote the server for you.
However, on the Online Safety Act, the people running the server, so my server that I'm running, in theory, I would have to check. I mean, it's not quite come into regulation yet, and they're still discussing it, is my understanding. How Ofcom are going to regulate this. But they seem to be moving towards the idea that I, as somebody who's running my own Matrix server on my own setup, have to work out whether a child is going to access it, and if then the child will access it, I then have to do age checks, and I have to implement things. For instance, they can't go on explicit channels in Matrix, which there are explicit rooms, same as you have in Discord or any of these other ones. So my understanding is that would actually be on me, right?
Yep, it would. And frankly, that's one of the other reasons why peer-to-peer Matrix is so important and interesting, because again, without servers, the obligation of somehow securing those servers becomes a lot more moot. And so from my perspective, if anybody is listening to this and has a couple of million a year that they want to put behind the bar to keep peer-to-peer Matrix running, just go and contact the Matrix Foundation or indeed Element so that we can try to make that happen, because that is, in the end, the best defense against basically a censorship system of the flavor that could result there. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't protect children or counter abuse, and there's another 4-hour podcast to be had about how you handle trust and safety and anti-abuse on a decentralized network. But you can do it, just like we do on the web and we do on email and the internet as a whole. And that is what we should be doing, rather than going and backdooring everybody's encryption just in case somebody does something bad.
Completely agree.
Matthew, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. It's fun navigating these hard problems with people who have to navigate it like us every day. And we wish you all the best on it. And again, as users, it's fun to be on this journey with you.
Well, thank you for having me on. It was fun and hopefully nothing too incriminating. And hopefully perhaps catch up some point in future and we can see whether my optimism was drinking too much coffee or whether it was well-founded in reality.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/pod sign up, and we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sapia, podcast produced by Max Bennell for Privacy International.